Welcome, dear horror writer. Tonight we're stepping into the shadows of the supernatural, where the veil between worlds thins and the dark grows restless. So allow me to set the tone and read to you an excerpt from this very well-preserved ancient tome I found buried in the walls of the scriptorium cellar. The candle burnt low in the crypt, its flame cowering as though it too feared the silence. Shadows swelled and wavered along the stone walls, stretching into forms that seemed almost alive. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies left too long in the dark, their sweetness turned sickly, meddling with the damp breath of the earth. There, in the crypt, Cerise thought herself alone, yet from the depths of the chamber rose a sound that did not belong, a slow exhalation, ragged and wet, like soil being drawn through the lungs of something buried long ago. Cerise lifted the candle, her icy breath rattling its light across the stones, but to her joy, nothing stirred in its glow. The silence returned, yet the air seemed to tighten, the cold gathering until it pressed against her skin, burrowing into her bones. She could feel the breath itching its way along her neck, then coiled down her spine, which caused her bones to turn to stone. The breath lingered, colder still, and then she felt it, the pale claws tightening around her jaw as a delicate graze of fangs punctured her throat, spilling warm blood down her chest. Welcome to Supernatural Horror. So what is supernatural horror? So supernatural horror is a horror subgenre that shows us what happens when something beyond the laws of nature intrudes into the world of the living. It's the moment when the natural order is broken and we get occurrences of ghosts haunting the living, demons that take over bodies and rewrites them to its will, and curses that bind families in mania and tragedy for generations. These stories, as you may have guessed it, explore themes of the afterlife, the supernatural, and the unknown by creating unease and terror from challenging the boundaries of reality. These forces don't play by our boring human rules, and that's precisely why they're terrifying. Now, this is where supernatural horror differs from its other horror relatives. Realistic horror, like slashers, is rooted in human violence and the fact that human beings can be monsters themselves. Psychological horror lives in the mind and paranoia and delusion, where the terror is that you can't even trust your own thoughts. But supernatural horror lives in the realm of forces beyond human control. The terror is not just that something is out there, it's that it's bigger than you, beyond you, and unstoppable. What makes supernatural horror work so well is that it unmoors us and unsettles us because it challenges our very understanding of reality, of mortality, and of safety itself. It takes the ordinary world that we believe that is stable and rips it open. Now, before we move on, let's clear up the differences between supernatural horror and paranormal horror because they often get lumped together, but they have subtle differences. So, supernatural horror deals with forces that defy the natural order, like ghosts, demons, curses, cosmic entities, essentially things that simply shouldn't exist. Paranormal horror, on the other hand, leans more into phenomenon that feels like it could exist on the fringes of reality, and is usually tied to pseudoscience or unexplained mysteries like psychic powers, telekinesis, UFO encounters, or ESP. So you can think of it this way. Supernatural horror unsettles us by breaking the rules of nature, while paranormal horror unnerves us by suggesting that those rules might already be bending in ways we don't fully understand. Now, onto the roots. So, supernatural horror, while it has become more popular within the last century, it's actually much older than that. In fact, it might be the oldest kind of horror that we have. Before books and films, we communicated stories through oral traditions. People told stories about banshees shrieking outside the door before death arrived, which can be traced back all the way to the 8th century, and first seen in literature in 1380. People also told stories about revenants crawling back from the graves and demons waiting in the shadows of the churchyard. Folklore and superstition were the first horror stories passed down not only to frighten children not to go out at night, but to warn, to explain what couldn't be explained, and to give shape to fears people lived with daily. Now, as literature took root, the Gothic era transformed these whisper stories into haunted castles, cursed lineages, and tragic heroines. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe and Sheridan Lee Fown gave the supernatural its Gothic bones. The crumbling mansions, ghosts tied to madness and decay, and the sense that history itself haunts the living. These were explorations into sin, decay, and death, all wrapped in the supernatural veil. Then came the Victorians, whose obsession with death and the afterlife gave rise to seances, mediums, and the entire spiritualist movement. This is an era where people genuinely believed they could speak to the dead, and horror naturally reflected that cultural fixation. This is also where the Ouija board was created. Ghost stories like those scribed by M.R. James thrived in a world where the veil between life and death felt thinner than ever. In this era, the supernatural was both terrifying and something many secretly longed to believe in. In the modern age, supernatural horror exploded into new form. Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House gave us ambiguity where ghosts could be real or could be products of psychological breakdown. Stephen King, my fave, married the supernatural with small-town Americana, showing how the otherworldly could invade the everyday. Japanese horror, from The Ring to The Grudge, reimagined curses and vengeful spirits for a contemporary world. And today, franchises like The Conjuring continue to keep the tradition alive, which I quite honestly wish they would just put the sequels and prequels to rest by blending folklore, religion, and cinematic terror. So the key takeaway here is that supernatural horror has always been a mirror, which is a lot like Gothic horror as well. It reflects our anxieties about death, guilt, sin, faith, and the unknown. Every generation reshapes the ghost story or the demon story for its own fears. And that's why these tales never die, because they're about us. At the heart of every supernatural horror story lies its core elements, the things that separate it from the other subgenres and gives it that lingering uncanny chill. So the first core is atmosphere. Supernatural horror thrives in environments that feel alive, which means that the setting needs to be an active presence, one that seems to breathe in tandem with the characters and move against them. Think of Hill House in The Haunting of Hill House, where we see the mansion act as a malevolent force that shapes the minds and emotions of those who enter. And in film, we can look at the Blair Witch Project, where we see the setting trap its characters in a forest that feels sentient, where every tree and rustle gives off the impression that something is watching them. And these spaces are usually liminal, and they give off the feeling that they're thresholds between the ordinary and the otherworldly. Like a hallway, a staircase, or a lonely crossroads at midnight, these all become terrifying when written as though they have a will of their own. The next element is the unknown. In supernatural horror, like a lot of other horror actually, the less you explain, the greater the terror will be. Here, ambiguity fuels fear because it forces the audience to participate with their imagination, filling in the blanks with their own worst possibilities. Like a ghost glimpsed once in the corner of a mirror is more frightening than a ghost who lingers too long in the light, unless it's reveal time. We can look at H.P. Lovecraft, who mastered this by leaving his cosmic horrors beyond description, suggesting glimpses of shapes and colors that the human mind could not comprehend. And it's this lack of clarity that destabilizes the reader because they can never pin down the rules of what they're actually seeing. The unknown lingers long after the book is put down because it makes readers or viewers ask themselves, what did I just witness, and could this actually be real? Symbolism is another crucial core. In the best supernatural horror stories, the monster or entity, while yes, they're frightening figures, but they're also the representation of something deeply human. Ghosts often symbolize grief, loss, or injustice. Like in The Sixth Sense, the apparitions are terrifying, but each one embodies unresolved pain. Now, we also have demons that traditionally reflect temptation, corruption, or crises of faith, such as in The Exorcist, where the possession is not just about a demon entering Reagan, but about a priest wrestling his own doubts. We also have curses that usually represent ancestral trauma or the sins of the past returning to destroy the present. And we can see this in the Japanese horror film The Grudge. These supernatural forces are metaphors made flesh, and when used well, they allow the horror to resonate on both a visceral and psychological level. Now let's talk about rules because they're essential even in a world where the unnatural reigns supreme. Because your audience will accept anything from ghosts to curses to ancient entities, so long as the narrative has internal consistency. A spirit might be able to pass through walls, but maybe it can only come out at night or show itself to a certain person. Or a demon might have immense power, but it has to be summoned from a specific ritual or banished by a specific phrase. Rules create suspense because they hint at both hope and doom. And boundaries, even subtle little ones, make the supernatural feel more real. If you give the impression that the entity can do whatever it wants at any time that it wants, then the fear weakens because the tension between possibility and inevitability vanishes just like your ghost. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't write a rogue demon or an entity that no one knows how to contain, because many stories actually do thrive on exactly that and get their tension from situations like that. But even those end up bound by some hidden logic that the characters eventually figure out. And of course, you're always free to subvert that expectation entirely because this is horror after all. You can do whatever you want. And finally, supernatural horror relies a lot on tension and pacing. It's not a genre that usually benefits from relentless shocks and gore, but rather, like gothic horror, it's a slow burn that's a carefully measured escalation of dread. Like, think of the pacing in Hereditary, which begins as an unnerving family drama, then slowly builds into a crescendo of cults and demons. Or in The Turn of the Screw, where the governess's sightings of figures at the window are stretched out across long passages of psychological ambiguity. The trick is to sustain dread over time, which means giving the audience moments of calm only to take those moments away when they feel the safest. Terror lies in the anticipation of the supernatural, not just in its appearance. The protagonist is the beating heart of any story, and in supernatural horror, if there's no compelling character, then the ghosts, demons, or curses lose their weight because then they're just haunting air. Horror in this subgenre works best when the audience feels the haunts alongside the character and when they're drawn into the protagonist's fear and uncertainty. This is why supernatural horror is usually very character driven. So supernatural horror has a few different archetypes of protagonists, so let's break them down. First, there's the skeptic, which is probably the most common character you're going to find in supernatural horror. This is the character who refuses to believe in the supernatural until they're given undeniable proof. Their journey also mirrors your reader's own suspension of disbelief, and their eventual realization that it's really all true intensifies the horror. In the supernatural realm, skeptics usually become the most broken by the truth because they're so ignorant that in return, it shatters them. Next, we have the believer who sits at the opposite end of the spectrum of the skeptic. This is the character who already accepts that the supernatural is real, and because of that, it means that they're usually isolated, ridiculed, or dismissed by those around them. Believers can create tension in a narrative because they see what others refuse to acknowledge, and that in return creates dramatic irony. The innocent is another archetype which is usually embodied by children or naive figures who lack the defenses to fight or resist the supernatural. Danny Torrance in The Shining is the quintessential innocent who's a child with psychic abilities that's being preyed on by the Overlook Hotel's ghosts. The innocent's vulnerability heightens the horror because audiences will feel protective of them, and the cruelty of the supernatural feels even more unbearable when it preys on those least able to fight back. And lastly, we have the guilty. These are characters that are being haunted by the external entities and also by their own sins, secrets, or grief. Guilt makes them susceptible to the supernatural as if their own conscience has opened the door for the spirits to enter. Like in The Telltale Heart, the narrator's guilt becomes a kind of haunting in itself. In many ghost stories, the guilty are pursued until their wrongdoing is exposed or punished. This archetype resonates because it reflects a primal fear that our past, no matter how deep we buried it, that it will keep coming back to haunt us. Now, as for their arc, protagonists in supernatural horror usually traverse a simple path which goes like this. They start in disbelief, which shifts into terror, and finally forces them into confrontation or destruction. Whether they survive or not depends on the story, but the key is that their journey must feel emotionally tied to the supernatural. Sure, a haunting or possession that happens at random can be scary, but one that connects directly to the protagonist's inner life is devastating. Let's take Dracula as an example. Jonathan Harker starts in disbelief, brushing off the strangeness of the Count's castle as eccentricities. Soon, disbelief gives way to terror, and he realizes he's a prisoner in the hands of something inhuman. That terror escalates into confrontation when Van Helsing and the others take up fight against Dracula, and not all of them survive the ordeal. What makes this arc so effective is that the threat isn't just external, but it's also preying on vulnerabilities like lust, faith, and the fragility of the body. Mina's corruption by Dracula in particular becomes deeply personal, transforming the supernatural horror into an intimate reflection of their own fears and flaws. By giving our characters weaknesses, desires, and relatable fears, you make them human. Readers will only fear for a character if they care about them, and they'll only care if the characters feel real. The curse or entity should feel like it was meant for them, a mirror of their psyche and the shadow they cannot escape. Supernatural entities are the lifeblood of the genre, that are the embodiments of fear, anxieties, and longings that echo through human history. They terrify us because they reveal something about us, and their power lies in how they are shown, withheld, and understood by characters. So here's a little history lesson and breakdown on the most popular supernatural entities. So first we have ghosts, which are probably one of the earliest supernatural figures in human storytelling. In ancient Mesopotamia, restless spirits were thought to rise from corpses that weren't buried properly. The Greeks told of shades wandering the underworld, and Roman households practiced rituals to appease the dead during Lemuria festivals. In Japan, Yurei stories have shaped centuries of ghost lore, with their white burial kimono and long black hair still influencing modern horror cinema. Now, visually, ghosts usually appear fragmented in the form of pale silhouettes in the corner of the eye, as cold drafts that sweep through old rooms, or voices that echo from the walls. And their forms usually mirror how they died. So, for example, the spirit of someone who drowned might have their specter dripping water for eternity, or someone who was hanged could appear with a twisted neck. Narratively, ghosts represent memory, trauma, and unfinished business, and they're very rarely just there to haunt. So a ghost is used to force the living to reckon with the past, whether it's a personal secret, a cultural wrong, or generational grief. Next, we have demons, which appear in almost every religious and folkloric system, though their nature changes a bit depending on the culture that you're looking at. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians feared spirits like the Utuku and Galu, believed to spread disease in misfortune. In Christian theology, demons are cast as fallen angels, servants of Satan who seek to corrupt and destroy. During medieval Europe, demons took center stage in tales of possession and witch trials, which fueled centuries of fear and persecution. In the Islamic tradition, the jinn is said to take on a more complex role and is capable of both benevolence and malice that exists in a space between the human and the divine. Now, in horror, demons can manifest through whispers, shadows, summoning rituals, or possessions before ever revealing their true grotesque forms to anybody. And their appearance quite often reflects what they corrupt, so like twisted bodies, distorted voices, defiled innocence. And a demon's true danger lies in their ability to erode faith, mortality, or sanity. Like we see in The Exorcist, the demon Pazuzu isn't only tormenting Reagan, but it's also attacking Father Damien's belief system and dragging him into spiritual despair. Now let's hop on our brooms and fly over to the territory of witches and occult forces. So the witch is one of the most enduring figures in horror, partly because she's always lived at the crossroads of fear and fascination. The European imagination was reshaped by works like the Malleus Maleficarum, which was a handbook for identifying and prosecuting witches witches that help spread paranoia across the continent and contribute to the wrongful deaths of tens of thousands of people, which were mostly women. Because honestly, if you've ever read this book, Heinrich Kramer's view on women was just downright insane. And then in 1692, we enter Salem, where accusations of witchcraft expose the explosive mixture of religious zeal, superstition, and societal tension. But with all of this negativity surrounding witches, that's not to say that witches were only thought to be villains. In Slavic folklore, Baba Yaga lives in a house on chicken legs, and from time to time she likes to devour little children, but she also provides guidance to those brave enough to confront her. We can also see in pre-Christian Europe where cunning folk and wise women who knew herbs, charms, and midwifery often walked the line between healer and suspected sorcerer. Now, across cultures, witches usually occupy liminal spaces like the forest edge, the hearth, and the boundary between birth and death. And while witches can come across as unsettling because they're usually portrayed as being malevolent, but they're usually also unsettling because they hold knowledge that others don't have, like the understanding of plants, rituals, how the body works, the cycles of nature, and the invisible world. Essentially, the witch is feared because she sees cracks in the order of things. So symbolically, witches are mirrors of cultural anxiety. As we can see in patriarchal societies, accusations of witchcraft are more often than not targeted at women who were widowed, childless, or too independent, and in return made the witch an avatar of resistance. In modern horror, the witch has also become a figure of empowerment. We can see this in films like The Witch that shows how accusations of witchcraft grow out of paranoia, but also how embracing the witch path can symbolize liberation from oppressive systems. Now, few supernatural creatures have evolved as much as the vampire. In Eastern European folklore, vampires were bloated, ruddy corpses that rose from their graves to drink blood. The Slavic Upir and the Romanian Strigoi were feared not as aristocrats we're used to getting now, but as infectious revenants. It was John Polidori's The Vampire in 1819 and later Bram Stoker's Dracula that reshaped them into the elegant, seductive predators that we now know today. So visually, as I just said, vampires straddle two extremes. They can be the refined aristocrat that's pale, seductive, and alluring, or the feral corpse that's crawling out from the grave. Vampires move between beauty and decay and are always linked by hunger. This appetite makes them intimately tied to body and its vulnerabilities like sex, disease, and mortality. So vampires represent desire, predation, and addiction. They can symbolize sexual repression like we see in Dracula, disease and contagion like in The Hunger, or loneliness and immortality like in The Interview with the Vampire. And the rules that govern them, like burning to a crisp when exposed to sunlight, needing to be invited into a home, needing to drink blood to survive, and sleeping in coffins, are both narrative tools and metaphors for boundaries between life and death. And lastly, we have cosmic beings, which are the youngest of the archetypes, but probably the most unsettling ones. Popularized by H.P. Lovecraft in the early 20th century, cosmic beings draw from the philosophical, you know what I'm trying to say, fears of humanity's insignificance in the universe. Unlike demons or vampires, they aren't inherently moral or immortal, but they're just utterly indifferent. These entities are best described in fragments, like having impossible angles, alien geometries, and colors that the human eye can't see, and by having vast bodies that can't be fully comprehended. And they usually exist outside of human time, stretching across eons or dimensions, and just by merely perceiving them can drive a character into madness, because their existence is too much for the human mind to understand. Now, symbolically, as you might have guessed it, cosmic beings embody existential dread. They force us to confront a universe that's not built for us, and that doesn't care if we live or die. We can see this in stories like The Call of Cthulhu, where the horror is less about Cthulhu and more about the revelation that humanity is insignificant. So now you can see that supernatural entities endure because they're ideas embodied by flesh and blood. If we're talking about ghosts, then fog. So now that we've gone through the already made fears, now it's time to talk about how you can create your own supernatural entity. So here's how. So, first, you want to begin with a fear or theme you want to explore. So, ask yourself, what anxiety lies at the center of your story? Is it grief, betrayal, addiction, alienation? Then, imagine what fear looks like if it took a physical form. If it's grief, then maybe it manifests as a figure that carries fragments of the dead. If it's betrayal, then maybe it has two faces, one that's smiling and another that's rotting, kind of like the mayor of Halloween Town. Next, you're going to choose its origin. Does it derive from folklore, a cursed location, an alternate dimension, or even the character's own psyche? Then you're going to plan its manifestation. And remember, it's small signs at first, like unexplained sounds, strange symbols, or dreams. And then they escalate to direct encounters with the entity. Next, you're going to establish the entity's rules or limitations because remember, having boundaries in return makes your entity more believable and increases the tension of the narrative. And finally, preserve mystery. Don't explain every detail of its nature. A gray supernatural entity frightens because it exists at the edge of understanding, both monstrous and meaningful. When you're writing supernatural horror, the techniques you use are just as important as the ghosts or demons you've chosen to unleash. The supernatural thrives on atmosphere, mystery, and suggestion. If you show your hand too early or rely on loud shocks, if you're writing a screenplay that is, then you'll lose what makes the genre so effective. Instead, you want to play with anticipation and perception, pulling the audience into a state where they can't trust what they're seeing, hearing, or even feeling. So let's look at some of the techniques you can use to achieve that. First, let's start with foreshadowing and omens, two of the oldest tools in supernatural horror. They're effective because they tap into our instinctive need to find patterns in the world around us. When a dog refuses to enter a room, we wonder what it's sensing. When a clock stops at the same time every night, we start to question what significance that hour has. When a window that was shut the night before is found open in the morning, we can't help but ask what or who opened it. These small disturbances work the reader in the same way, planting unease long before the supernatural fully reveals itself to us. The trick to achieving this is subtlety. These signs should seem harmless at first, almost dismissible, and grow more and more unsettling as they accumulate. Each small event adds another layer of dread until the reader realizes, which is usually too late, that they've been led step by step into the heart of the supernatural. We can look at Dracula that before the Count fully reveals his true nature, the land itself seems to resist Jonathan's arrival. Wolves howl in the distance, storm clouds gather, and the locals whisper heeds and warnings while clutching tightly to their crucifixes. As you can see, none of these things directly announce the horror that's going to come, but together they prepare the reader for the unnatural presence waiting in the castle. Another technique is creating an unreliable reality. One of the reasons supernatural horror unsettles us is because it destabilizes our trust in our own senses. If your protagonist hears voices that no one else hears or sees fleeting shadows that vanish when they turn, you force both the character and the reader to question what's real. Now, this approach makes the supernatural frightening, but it also builds paranoia. A good test of this is to have your characters ask themselves, am I losing my mind or is this really happening? That uncertainty is great for dread because we're left wondering which one it actually is. Maybe it's even both. Now, objects can also serve as conduits of horror. Things like a doll, a mirror, a book, or even something as ordinary as a wedding ring can become the vessel through which supernatural energy can bleed into the story. And the reason this works so well is because it takes something safe and familiar and twists it into a threat. Haunted objects are especially powerful when they carry history. A locket that belonged to a murdered child, a diary written in the days before a person took their own life, or a mirror from a house that burnt down all carry an aura of the past, which will naturally give off a sense that touching or using these objects might invite something else in. The best advice here is to think of objects as characters with their own motives and secrets. Now, imagery and language are the veins through which supernatural horror breathes, and the uncanny is your best friend here. Think of stillness that lasts too long, silence in a place where there should be sound, the faint smell of rot where nothing is decaying. Your description should make the ordinary feel slightly wrong. For example, instead of describing a shadow as long, you might say it stretched across a wall as if it were trying to touch the living. Also, try to avoid using adjectives like scary or creepy, which I mean, using them is 100% fine in your dialogue, but try to limit it in your prose. Instead, you want to focus on sensations like the cold air brushing against the protagonist's neck, the slow creak of wood with no weight on it, or the way candlelight seems to falter when someone speaks a forbidden name. Finally, you want to think about the rhythm of your story. Supernatural horror works best when it alternates between the slow and the sudden. So that means you want to build tension gradually by using atmosphere and suggestion to tighten the reader's nerves. And then when they're convinced themselves that nothing is coming, that's when you strike with a sudden reveal, like a hand on the shoulder, the face in the mirror, or the door slamming shut with no one near it. That shift from slow burn to sudden terror creates a visceral jolt. Just don't overuse it, especially in screenwriting, because it will lose its effect very quickly. All you really need are 1 or 2 moments of sudden terror. Now let's pull all these techniques into an actual framework that you can use for writing your own supernatural horror story. So here a story begins with a world that feels grounded and safe, like a family moves into a new house, a priest tends to his parish, or a group of teenagers spend the night in an abandoned cottage. Now these opening moments might feel almost mundane, but that's completely intentional because the point of this is contrast. The stronger the sense of ordinary life, the more jarring the intrusion of the supernatural will feel later on. Now, you're going to introduce those subtle disturbances. The first brush your characters have with the supernatural should feel small, deniable, and easy to brush off. And these early moments aren't meant to terrify the characters silly, but they should instead plant a seed of unease into them. Things like a strange sound, a flicker of movement in their peripheral, a sudden chill. Each one seems harmless in its own, but combined together, they weave an atmosphere of escalating eeriness. The important thing here is to remember to use restraint. Don't show off all of your supernatural goodies too early. You want to let the characters rationalize these moments because their denial is what's going to build suspense. Now, the next stage is escalation and denial, and this is the stage where the disturbances are going to intensify, but the characters are going to still cling to logic. Doors violently slam shut, nightmares grow vivid and more bizarre, objects move, maybe one character sees something no one else does, and suddenly they're being called hysterical. And this denial stage is critical because it keeps the tension alive. If all your characters immediately believe in the supernatural, then the mystery is going to evaporate. Instead, you're going to let them argue, resist, or explain it away, which in return can create some devastating consequences for some of them later on. Now, at some point in your story, you're going to reach the stage where the uncanny force, aka your entity, can no longer be denied. All those hints and disturbances you've been planting this entire time give way to the full revelation. And when we see the ghost finally showing itself, the curse claiming the first victim, or the possession taking complete hold, this is the turning point where the supernatural shifts from suggestion to undeniable presence. And both the character and the reader must confront the reality that the horror is real and it's hungry. Now, a little tip here is don't confuse revelation with full exposure. You don't need to show everything, but by all means, you can. Everyone's story is different. But sometimes all you need for an effective revelation is seen in things like a glimpse of something inhuman, the sound of a voice that doesn't exist, or the shadow of something too large to fit the room. And another tip is to think of your revelation as a shift in tone. Up until now, your characters have been thinking that they have complete control. But once the supernatural force is revealed, they then realize that control is gone. And that shift from rational explanation to helplessness is where the real fear begins. Now, back in the protagonist section, I talked about your protagonist having a personal connection to the supernatural entity. Well, this is where it's going to come out and play, and it's going to be devastating. This is going to manifest in ways like maybe a grieving mother hears her child's voice in the night or sees a lifelike specter of them, or a priest struggling with their faith is attacked by a demon that mocks his doubts, and the demon is winning. Essentially, the supernatural force should feel like a mirror held up to the protagonist's deepest vulnerabilities, and they're breaking the mirror. Now for the next step, the gloves are coming off. We see the entity growing bolder, stronger, and more destructive. Here, where long past footsteps in the hallway are whispering in ears, now it's full-on possession, violent attacks, and full apparitions. As for the characters, they can no longer ignore or deny what's happening, and they're forced to act to survive. So this stage is all about building momentum towards the climax. Every encounter should feel like the stakes are climbing higher. Someone might be injured or slowly bleeding out. Someone else might be corrupted and no remnants of their old self remain. And also the tension between the characters that's been escalating now reaches its breaking point and they crack. A tip here is to push the characters into making choices. Do they stay and try to be the heroes, which in horror statistics has a very low rate of survival? Or do they say, nice knowing ya, and flee? Do they believe or continue denying what's right in front of them? Or do they try to fight back, or do they give in and accept their fate? You want to think about the escalation not just as the supernatural intensifying, but about humans reaching their limits. Now we've reached the climax where the human and the supernatural collide head on. This is where we see the ritual or exorcism taking place, the discovery of the curse's origins and how it can be stopped, and the desperate escape. And if you want your climax to hit really hard, then have it work on two levels. The first is the battle with the supernatural, and second is the struggle within the human soul. For example, if your story is about guilt, then the climax should force the protagonist to face their guilt. If it's about faith, then their beliefs should be tested to the breaking point. The supernatural should always echo the emotional core of the story, so the climax feels like the inevitable just waiting to happen. And a little tip, try avoiding tidy resolutions. Victory in supernatural horror usually comes at a cost, like someone is sacrificed, someone is eternally corrupted, or someone is scarred for life. Even if the characters do manage to destroy the entity, don't let your protagonist walk away unchanged. Instead, make them suffer. And speaking of suffering, supernatural horror is a subgenre that almost never ends cleanly. The goal in these narratives isn't closure, but rather unease. Maybe the ghost was busted and it's gone, but the family can never live in the house again. Maybe the power of Christ compelled the demon back to hell, but the priest has lost his faith. Or maybe the vampire is staked and barbecued, but the infection has already spread to the protagonist. Supernatural horror endures because it reflects to us that we're never fully in control of our lives. We may believe in science and reason and in solidity of the world around us, but the idea that something unseen could slip through the cracks terrifies us. These stories don't frighten us simply because there's the chance that the ghost might exist, but because if they truly do, then our pain, our grief, our guilt, and our sins never really die. And so, dear horror writer, we draw the curtain on tonight's descent into the supernatural. I hope you leave with new phantoms to work with and new ways to breathe dread into your stories. If you found this deep dive helpful, don't forget to show it some spooks by giving it a like, maybe even subscribing, which I heard actually helps cure curses, and ring the bell so the gravedigger knows that you're still alive in the coffin. Until then, keep your candles burning low, keep your quills sharp, and never forget that the supernatural is always closer than you think. Bye-bye.